Start off by thanking everybody for being here today. Thank you for Kim and the team for inviting us to speak. For Hiba and Nsini, who said, sure, of course we will. And to all of you for joining us. And I guess I have one disclaimer. I work for the federal government, but I am not the federal government. I work for the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, and I'm going to be talking today about the NIH data management and sharing policy, which was rolled out a couple of years ago and actually takes effect next week. And I didn't make up the policy, but I am a big fan of it. I'm just going to put that out in front. It's something I'm excited about. And I also don't read a lot of scripts, so if I forget to say something, be sure to ask. So I want to talk about sharing NIH-funded data. I want to talk a little bit about how we got to where we are today and where you can find resources, and that's about all I've got time for. So are you ready for the NIH's data management and sharing policy? And if you are, then you'll know that the only three things you have to be thinking about right now is planning and budgeting for the management and sharing of your research data, that you know that you have to submit a data management and sharing plan for review as part of your application to the NIH beginning next week. And then you'll have to comply with the approved plan. So I'm hoping to unpack that a little bit. Note that individual institutes like NINDS, centers or offices may have additional policies or expectations. And many of us are building this plane as we fly it. I just want to be honest there. We don't know what it's going to look like. And so your input is really important in order for us to build something that's going to work for you. So why now? So I have a couple of slides to head up, but at a prior meeting that a few of you were at for spinal cord injury, I played this little video, but it's been about 13 years since open data advocates have been educating everybody about why it is important to share data. And it's important for the science. We hope to get all of the data that didn't make it into the journal to not go into the trash bin. And that's really the goal of making data available, to increase the transparency of what experiments have been done, why and how, to increase the reuse for other uses other than just to tell the story, which is a very important part of it, but not all of the story goes into the articles. And hopefully to reduce redundancy and waste and loss by not having people repeat things that haven't worked already. It's also the right thing to do for taxpayers. So you all pay tax money, and that's how we pay your grant. And so what many of you may not know is that 10 years ago, in February of 2013, there was a memo that came down from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, and the memo stated that any agency of the federal government that administers grants that are over $100 million in a year, which includes the NIH, obviously, has to develop a plan. And the plan has to explain how the direct results of all federally funded scientific research can be made available to and useful for the public, industry, and the scientific community. And they included peer-reviewed publications and digital data. So this was 2013. The plan was due within 24 hours. I mean, 24 hours, within a year. I don't know where that came from. And so NIH did come up with a plan in 2015, and they published the plan. And they said, here's where we're at now. Where we were at now in 2015 was that we had developed a way for scientific publications after an embargo period to become publicly available in PubMed Central. And I remember being at NIH while this plan, the PubMed Central plan, had actually started a few years before 2015. So they were already ahead of the game. But this was not rolled out really smoothly. It was very difficult to actually get everything publicly available. And now it's old hat. So there's a sunny future that once we get through this transition period, this will be old hat. But in 2015, all we had for sharing digital scientific data was a policy published in 2003. And it just said that if your grant was for specific funding opportunities or for over $500,000 a year, in direct costs, that you had to have a plan, but there was nothing else to it except you had to have a plan, and someone had to think it was an okay plan, and there was no compliance. So we had to put meat on this. I say we being the NIH over the next 10 years. So this was the process. Beginning in 2016, the NIH Office of the Director began to collect information from the public about what scientific data should be shared. In 2018, they put out a request for information on proposed provisions for the policy. Then they drafted a policy in 2019 and put out a request for comment. So a lot of public input in this process. Final policy was released in October of 2020, giving us 27 months until today's date in order to implement it. So the whole policy, when it was first released in October of 2020, was a series of NIH notices with a lot of information, a lot of resources already. So that's what the policy is, and everything that's been built out from that has been to help people understand the process that is needed in order to share all scientific data. So this is the beginning of a culture change. We're here, and we're excited about the future. So the requirements are, number one, plan ahead. That's the most important thing. That's where we're at right now. Unlike the olden days where we would get a grant, do experiments, and then later on decide whether or where to share our data, the idea is put that planning stage up front. And then when you submit your application, you submit it with a data management and sharing plan. And then once you've submitted, you comply with it. All NIH supported research generating scientific data is subject to this plan, this requirement, which includes everything pretty much except for training for infrastructure grants, and just all research grants are going to be subject to it. So what's in the plan is all recorded factual material, material of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, not lab notebooks, not gels, not preliminary analyses, not peer reviews, not physical objects, not your notebooks, just the data that is needed in order to understand and replicate the data. The timelines of when to share data are going to be the hardest, I think, for us to enforce, and it's no later than the publication or the end of the award for unpublished data, whichever comes first. And so this is actually happening in conjunction with journals that are now also asking for the data to be publicly available at the time of publication. So where can you find information? There is a whole lot of information at the NIH data sharing website. I highly encourage you to take some time, get yourself a cup of tea, and sit back and look through all of the information that's available from the NIH on what is required and how to move forward, because there are so many kinds of data and so many different ideas, repositories, and things available on this website. So how do you write a plan? Again, the most important thing right now is to develop a plan for your data. And so on the website is a stepwise process to develop your plan. And the first thing you want to do is confirm that your research is definitely subject to the DMS policy. And I will say for almost everybody in the room, that is the case. Identify what methods and repositories you want to use for managing and sharing your data. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Once you have identified where your data will fit, then you develop your plan. And don't forget to estimate and request funds in your budget for data management and sharing. So how do you find a repository, and why is that the first step? One of the reasons that it's the first step is because once you identify a repository to put your data into, that repository probably will help you answer all of the other questions involved in planning for your data. You want to know, in order to find a repository, whether or not it will ingest or work with the kind of data that you're collecting. Our preference is for everyone to try to identify a domain-specific open access repository. Those are the things that are most important. That it be a repository that holds the same kind of data as yours, that's the domain specific, and that it is open access. But there are some considerations. Do you have human subjects? or no? Is your human subject data de-identified, or is your human subject data subject to privacy concerns? Do you have genomics data? And if so, you may be subject also to the NIH genomic data sharing policy. Domain-specific repositories for this audience, FITBER for TBI data. There's also the Open Data Commons for spinal cord injury data. There are also specific model organism data repositories that you can look at. If you have imaging data, there are specific repositories that are good for imaging data. So these are the desirable characteristics for all data repositories. NIH has these available. I don't want to take time to read this, but basically data that is open, that is well curated, that has strong, good metadata, the metadata being the definitions that go so that other people can understand what your data means. And that they have a future. So should be a repository that's going to be around for a while, that's going to provide digital object identifiers so we can cite your data when we use it, and that it has a plan for long-term reuse. So what's going to happen when you submit your data and your DMS plan? So I stole this diagram on the left side here from the Center for Scientific Review, or CSR, and it basically describes that when you submit an application, it goes to the review, goes to a study section, then it's assigned to an institute like NINDS, then it gets reviewed again by an advisory council, and then the institute director takes final action. And I have to kind of play with this last one because the institute director makes final action in terms of approving or not approving funding. But the people who actually do the work of getting it from the final action into your hands are the program directors, Hiba Ensini and Linda Bambrick for spinal cord injury, and the grants management specialists. They're the ones that are going to help get it out the door. So when you submit your application with your data management sharing plan attached, what's going to happen next week is the application is going to go to study section. The data management sharing plan is going to get stripped out of the back of that. It's going to be hidden from the reviewer's view, and that data management sharing plan is going to be available to the institute, and it's going to be available to your program directors. So that is a conscious decision that NIH Central made with a lot of controversy around it. And I'm supportive of this, except that the program directors have a lot of work to do going forward. And I'm supportive because it takes the knowledge of the domain-specific data repositories and puts it into the hands of the people who know those repositories. They know who the contacts are for those repositories. And so, you know, it's going to be a lot of work. But I think it's really in the best interest of the data itself that they made this final decision. So what do you need to put in your plan? Recommended to be no more than 2 pages. A single plan will include genomic data sharing and all other data. There's basically 6 elements that you have to answer. I won't go through all of them, but what I am going to tell you is that NIH has an optional fillable Microsoft Doc template. I'm going to tell you this is highly recommended. And I'm going to tell you it's highly recommended because it will allow the program officers, the program directors that I referred to be able to find the information that they need in a specified place in order to determine whether or not this plan is going to be acceptable for the kind of data that you have. So please, everybody in this room, tell all your friends, please use this template. It will be really helpful for us. The template is going to ask basically information about the data type. This is information you want to include in your plan, whether you use the template or not. The template gives you a structure to put it in, what kind of data it is, and which data will be preserved and shared. And if any data won't be shared, explain in this section why it won't be shared. What is the metadata, other relevant data, related tools, software, and code? These are not required to be shared, but you should list whether or not any is needed. Data standards that are appropriate to your data type, information about the repository. And so you can see that a lot of these questions you can get answered if you first decide what repository you're going to be going to. Then elements 5 and 6 have mostly to do with whether or not there's any data that may be sensitive and may require specific access distribution or reuse considerations. Specifically, human subjects data may have specific privacy considerations. There may be limited access to some repositories. And then finally, element 6 is who's going to be responsible for oversight of your plan. Might be the PI, might be somebody else on your team. So where you can get more information, as I said, the NIH website is fabulous. There are some data management sharing policy FAQs, which will overlap many of the questions you probably have. And there is a NIH email box. And we now have, for our institute, we have a new website on preparing your application that will walk you through every aspect of this. And we have a new, brand new, as of yesterday, a new data sharing email address. And those questions that you have specifically for NINDS about data sharing, we can field those and get those to the right person. So this is our brand new website. It's in our funding page, and under funding, it says preparing your application. Preparing your application, and then within that is a whole section on preparing your data management and sharing plan. And you can also get information, as you're going to hear, from your institution. If you have a specific funding opportunity announcement, you can look for the scientific contact at the bottom of that funding announcement. And program directors, Hiba and Sini, are here. And for spinal cord injury, peripheral nerve injury, it's Linda Bambrick. And that's all I have. I can finish up and stop sharing.